So I have my drawing down on the watercolor paper. This watercolor paper is Cansen's watercolor paper. It's a 30 sheet pad. It's 11 by 15, 140 pound weight that I bought at Hobby Lobby. I find it to be a good, it's also cold press. I find it to be a good durable surface if you need watercolor paper. You can also buy a sheet of Arches cold press, 140 pound by the sheet. I believe they come 22 by 30, maybe a little bit smaller. Those are probably the two good kinds of paper that you can use. I have lightly drawn my drawing, as you can see. I used an H pencil. You want to use the H pencils when you're drawing on watercolor paper, and you want to draw very, very lightly so that you don't break the fibers of the watercolor paper, and that you also don't get too dark. And when you're putting down the ink wash and it dries, and you can still see your pencil lines. We're going to try to do this in a way that we don't see a lot of that. Now, you can erase your lines later, but you want to make sure that your ink wash drawing is 100% dry before you even erase your lines. I would even let it dry for 24 hours before you get to that stage. This drawing, incidentally, is based on a statue bust of a Asian male from the 19th century. It's a beautiful bronze that is at the Detroit Institute of Art. I really like it. And we managed to get a picture of it with some very good shading and lighting on it. The first thing that you want to make sure you do is take into consideration your reference material and how you're going to project it onto your paper. Now, because we're not at school and we don't have access to the projectors anymore, I recommend that you either freehand draw your image on the paper as best you can, or you can use the gridding method, which I'm showing you right here. And the gridding method is dividing your paper into equal numbers of squares, vertically and horizontally, and then putting those same squares over top of the image that you're working, and then drawing what's in each square of your reference image onto your paper. And that way you can go back in and tighten it up. You can even divide those squares up into smaller and smaller squares. And you can do that as many times as you need to get the amount of detail that you need. It's always better to freehand draw, and that may end up being what you have to do. So, the first thing that I want to do is take into account the 6 divisions of light and dark. You should have learned about this in basic drawing. If you have not taken basic drawing, I will remind you there are 6 divisions of light and dark that determine the three-dimensional form of an object or a figure when light is hitting it. There is the brightest bright, which is the highlight, which will probably be up here. There are your light areas, the midtone or halftone, which is the actual color, if you want to say, but the actual value of the object when light is hitting it evenly. Then there is shadow. Then there are core shadows and cast shadows and reflected light. Reflected light is light that is bouncing off a surface into a dark area of the object that you are drawing or painting, or in this case doing the ink wash drawing. So what I like to do when looking at my objects is to create an even basic midtone, middle tone to start with in the areas that are going to be darkest, because those areas you don't want to just go and put down black right away. You want to build it up in layers to create depth. if you just put a flat black down, it's going to make that area read very flat, very graphic. And what we're trying to do is model the forms here, especially depending on what your subject matter is. So you want to build up those dark areas in a gradual wash. Now that will require you to lay down a wash and let it dry before you go on to the next coat, as it were. While that is drying, you can work on a different part of your drawing. If you need to speed up the process, you can get a hair dryer. Now remember, I have already sized this piece of watercolor paper. So remember, it's a good idea to do that. If you can't do that, that's okay. But be aware that if you don't size your paper ahead of time, it's probably going to buckle with the more water that you add to it. So I still highly recommend that you size your watercolor paper before you get started. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do is I've laid out some ink on my tray, and I've dipped my brush in the water and then dipped it into the ink. Now I have set aside an extra piece of watercolor paper, and I understand if you do not have this ability, but I have an extra piece of watercolor paper I've set aside to make little test marks so I can determine if the value that I'm putting down is correct. And this looks correct to me. So the first thing I'm going to do is address the very large dark areas with a darkish wash. It's not going to be black, it's just going to be a medium to darker gray. And I'm going to put that all down first to give me some structure to my drawing. Now, when you do this, the principles of laying down an ink wash are very similar to the principles of laying down a watercolor, and that is once you put it down, once you get the brush down, keep the brush down until you cover the area that you want covered. Okay, don't pick up and stop start. See if you can keep it even. Okay, you can push, you can pull to get the shapes that you want. I failed to mention also you'll want paper towel for this in case you screw up an area and you accidentally drip or put some ink where you didn't want it. You can quickly blot it up with some paper towel. So, continuing on. Now, what I'm also doing with this is covering areas that are joined together with the same even tone, because one area is going to be darker than the other, so I'm going to have to do that anyways. This is the general to specific method of applying value. You should have also learned that in 2D design maybe, or basic drawing. Reloading my brush. In watercolor and ink wash techniques, when you add new amounts of ink to your brush, it's called loading, because you are loading the brush with ink or pigment. And so I am just very carefully laying this down where I need it to go. Also be aware that your ink will probably dry when it's in a wash form a little lighter than what you put down. And remember, I'm doing what's called this term is called cutting. I am taking the pure ink and I'm cutting it with some water. You will definitely want to make some practice strokes to understand just how much how much ink versus water you want in order to get the correct value. Okay, it's all about value, and I'll talk a little bit about value as I'm doing this. Value is the relative light and darkness that we assign an object when we're working in color and in black and white. Okay, the value is based on a 10-point grayscale. That grayscale starts with, depending on how you number it, either 1 or 0 to be the lightest light, and 9 or 10 to represent the darkest dark. Number 5, a middle gray, right in the middle of that scale, and then all the various divisions in between. So if you're going towards 0, say 4, 3, 2, 1, they are going to gradually get lighter. When you go from 5 towards 9 or 10, they're gradually going to get darker. Now, one of the things about this type of ink that I'm using, the non-waterproof, one of the nice features of it is that you can re-wet it. The permanent ink that most people use does not re-wet very well. So you'll see in some areas that I will go in and I'm actually re-wetting the ink. Now what I'm doing here is I'm establishing a slightly darker value. This is what is called the core shadow. It is the darkest part of, well, it's not the darkest part. It is the part of the shadow where it is not being affected at all by any kind of reflected light. There's no light hitting a surface and bouncing into the shadow. It also represents the division of a hard angle between light and dark. Okay, it's an edge, and when it hits that core, when it hits that edge where the division of light and dark come together, there's a clear division. Okay, so that is what is known as the core shadow. So what I'm doing is just very lightly right now adding a second coat to these areas that I've already gone over in areas that need to be darkened. Now you notice in some areas I am not darkening the whole thing. That is because we are working from general to specific. We're working with a very large shape first, and then we're going to subdivide it into smaller shapes. Okay, so you start with a light medium tone in the areas that are darkest, and then subdivide those into smaller and smaller shapes. One thing you want to also be aware of when working with ink wash or watercolor, and that is any area of your drawing that needs to stay bright white does not get touched with the ink, or very small amounts of ink. Okay, so there are certain parts of this drawing that are not going to get touched with the ink. Okay, now I want to show you how to blend or gradiate. Well, it's called a gradation, but it's a gradient. That is, this area right here that I just laid down, while it's wet, I'm going to clean my brush off. And you do that by dipping it in water and then squeezing out the excess into a tray or the area or I mean the receptacle that you have for your dirty water. And I'm going to re-wet the brush with clean water, or as clean as I can get it. And while the ink is wet, I'm going to very, very lightly go over the area that I just laid down and drag it into an area to create, as best I can, some form of a gradient from dark to light. Doesn't always work, and that's okay. But what I'm trying to do is, and you can see it here in the core shadow, what I'm trying to do is soften the edge a little bit. Okay. So at this point, I can see that my paper is starting to buckle a little bit. So what I'm going to have to do is wait for it to dry or take a hair dryer. Now what I'm going to do is take a hair dryer to this. All right, so I have taken a blow dryer to this and dried out the paper. There is a small amount of buckling. What I've got here is very minimal. It will reduce the pooling of the ink when it hits a part of, like right here and right here, where there's a dip in the paper. When I lay ink down, it'll probably dribble down here. I'm going to have to work with it. So, keeping that in mind. The next thing that I'm going to do is start reinforcing these dark areas, and I want to get them to a degree where they are dark enough that I can start adding in some light areas. And what I'm doing, and I'm still using the same brush, this is about a medium brush, it's a number 10. What I'm doing is I'm just putting another layer of watercolor over areas that are going to be very, very dark. And the ratio of ink to water, you want to be very, very careful about that. You want to make sure that you don't get too dark right away. If you do, that's okay. All right? Again, you just work with it. Now I'm going to add a little more ink to this to really start laying in some areas that I know are going to be as fairly black. Like right in here. While it's wet, I'm going to clean off my brush, re-wet it, and then drag this in so that it, as you can see, gradiates into another color. Then I'm going to go back in with the darker ink over here. It's going to bleed a little bit, but sometimes bleed is good. Move on to the next area. This represents his eyebrows. Now this statue had, when I took when the photographs of this statue were taken, the eyes were very, very much sunken in, which is kind of why I like it, because they're very, very dark. So I want to keep that, but I'm not doing it 100% black. It's still just a very, very dark gray. Wetting my brush, cleaning it off so that I create a gradient. Do it with the other one. Now I'm still using the same kind of brush. I am going to switch to more or smaller brushes here soon. But not just yet, because there are still some very, very broad shapes that I want to create before I start getting smaller. And again, as you can see, I'm breaking these down into smaller and smaller areas of light and dark. I'm going to address the ear. Another thing that you want to do is learn touch. What I'm doing right now, if you can see, I'm If this were the paper, I am holding the brush like this, not at an angle. I'm using the tip of the brush, very much as you would if you were doing fine ink calligraphy painting. This does allow for more control. Cleaning off my brush so that I can take this area right up here. It's very hard edged in my reference image, so I want to just blend it up here a little bit. It's not going to be 100% perfect, and that's okay. All right, especially depending on what you have, what tools you're using right now. Again, we're doing triage, if you know what that means. We're working as we go along. We're solving problems as we go along. Okay. I'm going to use a bigger brush to cover the neck area. Incidentally, this is an old sable brush. It's a Grumbacher. It was my father's brush. This thing is about 50 years old. I love this brush. My father was an artist as well and used watercolor fairly extensively when he was in advertising. And he used to do production art. It's a great brush. They don't, as I'm sure you know the old saying, they don't make them like this anymore. If you can ever get your hands on old brushes and materials that are still in good shape, by all means, get your hands on them, because they'll last you a long time. So you can see this is already beginning to take 3 dimensions. This represents the corners of the mouth. I'm going to switch to a much smaller brush, but at the corners of our mouth, where our lips pull back, there's what I call a divot. It's just that little dark corner at the edge of the lips. And I'm just using water to spread this ink a little bit. I'm going to go back in with some clean water to spread it around a little bit. You got to be very, very careful. You don't want to get too wet too quickly. Okay, and there's a transition over here. Notice that I'm leaving this area open. Okay, in the picture, it's dark, and I've just added another layer to it. It's been my experience as a portrait artist, and again, I'm using a portrait as an example, but on the cheeks, there's generally a small amount of reflected light that comes through. And so I'm leaving that lighter. Now I've got a very small brush here. This brush, I'm going to start creating some of the more definite edges that are going to have definite hard shapes. They have more ink to them than they do water, but these are going to establish hard boundaries. I'm going to pick up a little bit of it using paper towel. Okay. So, moving forward, now that I've gotten these areas fairly dark, I'm going to go in with a very, very small amount of ink and lots of water. And remember, this ink goes a very long way. I'm going to start laying in very, very light washes in the areas that are going to represent areas of light. Being careful not to, well, I said I was being careful, but I'm not. Being careful not to ink over areas that are going to have highlights. Oh, I did it again. Boy, I'm really batting 1,000 today. There we go. Okay, so again, we're starting very, very general. Getting the edge of the nose. A little too much here. Again, if you lay something down, you can usually pick it up. And it'll usually end up, when you pick it up, you're always, no matter how quick you are, you're still going to end up with a little bit of residue. And usually it will be just the right amount of residue that you need. Okay, so little by little, I'm darkening, I'm moving from dark to light. That is the key. Going to create a gradient on the cheek. Pick it up a little bit. Darker here. I'm almost reaching a point. You will be able to tell, but I'm reaching a point where I'm going to have to stop and blow dry this again. When you clean your brush, you just need to squeeze it in the paper towel. Try not to pull it, because then you'll pull the tip off, which means you'll have to tape it again, and that's always a pain in the butt. Little pro tip there. One more pass up in the forehead area. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and blow dry this, but as you can see, I have now covered most, if not all, of the drawing. You should also change out your water frequently, which is what I'm going to do now. I'm going to start with some fresh water. Okay. So now I'm going to stop and go ahead and let this dry and blow dry at a moment. Okay, we're back. A couple of things. What I'm going to do next is continue the whole process of gauging areas that need to be darkened, taking these large, broad shapes and continuing to refine them, going back over areas of light that need to be blended in to areas of shadow, starting to create actual detail as far as the specifics of the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the contour of the head. What I'm going to do is continue working until I get to a point where I need to change out my water and blow dry the drawing again. And then I'm going to go ahead and bring this up to a near finish that I am not going to videotape, because it will take, I could literally go another hour, maybe more, just to bring this up to a final type finish. So the next segment of this video is going to have a significant jump in it. Be aware of that. The final portion of this video, I want to show you how to bring in fine details. I also want to show you a little bit about dry brushing, if I'm able to do it. A word about your paper. Again, when we're working, when you're using your brush, don't do what's called scrubbing. Don't sit and grind into your paper, especially when it's wet and when you're going in and reworking an area. That damages the fiber of the watercolor paper. It causes the paper to do what's called pilling, like a sweater, you know, where you get those little teeny balls that affect your sweater. And if you get to the point where you've grinded into your paper so much that you've damaged the weave of the paper, anything that you lay down is going to get into the subsurface of the paper and just start blooming and bleeding, and you will lose any ability to control that area at all. So when you are laying down ink, just glide. Okay, it's not it is drawing, but it's not drawing with a solid instrument like a pencil or a piece of charcoal. It is a flexible, soft brush. And all you need to do is just glide it along the surface. Okay, so be really mindful of that as you are working with the ink. Another thing that I'd like to bring up is I just realized, I mentioned earlier basic drawing and the principles of value, light and dark. I realized too late that many, if not all of you students, because you're in illustration, are not taking any fine art classes outside of life drawing. If you're currently in life drawing, great. If you have not had anything like that, you probably are sitting there and wondering what the heck is he talking about as far as the degrees of value. Again, I did my best to explain it. I think I'm demonstrating it here fairly clearly. If you want a clearer demonstration, or at least if you would like a presentation on working with value, I have a PowerPoint already created that explains the entire principle, and I can upload that to the class Canvas page. In fact, my just saying it means now I'm going to do that. So look for that as well. I will let you know so it can kind of explain to you these principles of value, the different types of value, and how an object is lit by light, and how it works with shadow. I'm far enough in this drawing now that I'm going to start using, in the areas that I want to be the darkest, I'm going to start using not full black, but very, very close to it. And I am going to very, very carefully lay it down into the final shape that I want it to take. Okay, I started with a very definite shape, or a very basic shape, but now I want it to actually start forming the really specific shapes that are involved here. Okay, remember, we're working from light to dark, so if there's ever a point where you're like, oh, I made that too dark, trust me, If it's around an area that is going to get darker anyways, you will probably not even be able to notice it. So, going to put in a mark where I know the nostril is located. Again, I'm going to reinforce those corner shadows of the mouth. I'm going to start defining the lower lip by putting a shadow down here where I see it. Also, if you have any questions that are more specific than what I am showing you now, you just get a hold of me. And I'll do my best to explain it to you. Again, creating gradations, blending areas that need it, determining where hard edges are going to be, remember with ink you can always go darker but can't go lighter. Oops. Okay, so you can see that I am now starting to really get in to some dark. I am committing to some dark areas. Keeping a lot of this open. I want to make sure that I don't get too dark. The reason for that is, let's say that I created all of these areas that I'm darkening as pitch black. To compensate that, to create for the roundness, I would have to start from that dark black to get to the light. So the areas that I am creating washes for would be darker than they're supposed to be because I made the darks too black. Okay, hard to explain, but I'll see if I can explain this adequately. Going back to value, when you work with an object that has light and dark, and it has a definite degree of light and darkness, if you go too dark, your mind compensates for that by making everything else dark. Okay, so you end up pressing your values a little further than you originally wanted them to be. Incidentally, this neck part I'm keeping very, very loose because I want it to kind of have a little bit of flair to it because it is a study. So I'm just kind of playing around with it in these areas that are going to be a little bit more in shadow. Now you can see this is an area of my paper that has dipped, and so that the ink is pooling down here. I'm gonna tap that a little bit, lighten it up. Now, I have to let that dry, so don't go back in there, because if I do, I'm getting the fibers too wet, and they'll start blooming, as it were, and I don't want that. Some artists do use blooming techniques, but that is an artistic, what they call artistic license. That's a style, that's a conscious choice. What we're trying to do is realistically render an object or objects as faithfully as we can to give the illusion of 3-dimension. Okay, so now I'm committing to these areas in the forehead and the cranium, purposely starting to darken those. But again, I'm leaving large areas open just in case they need to be much, much lighter, so I can create that illusion of 3-dimensional light. You know, the fact that I'm working from a photograph of a statue of a bronze is really going to make this darker than I would normally do. But it is a bronze, and I want to show you just how deep you can get with the ink. Now I'm taking this small brush and I'm going to start cleaning up some of my edges. I'm going to use it to create contours where they're needed. Okay, because you don't want raggedy edges. I do this lightly at first. You can always go back over it. It doesn't have to be dark. You can also turn your paper to work on it. I'm leaving this stationary so you don't get vertigo. You can kind of see where it's going. It's really tough for me to do that, but I think I'm managing so far. So normally I would be switching and turning this around as I need to. And you can do the same. Okay, I'm going to start getting into the nose a little bit. Get this nostril put in, and also coarse shadow. Because I know this entire area is going to be a lot darker. I'm also outlining the form, areas that need to be given a definite shape. When you get further along and you start getting into your rendering classes with John McDonald, he has a very well-worn phrase that is so true, and that is, it's all about the shapes. It isn't what you think you see, or actually, it isn't what you know to be there. Like I'm rendering the inside of basically where the eye socket is. I know it's an eye socket. I know what shape an eye socket has. But I'm rendering this based on the shape that is being created by the shadows, not the eye socket. Okay? So it is all about shape. Okay? Pay attention to shape. Later, when you become a very successful illustrator, you will be able to do that in tandem together. You'll be able to look at something, say, okay, I'm drawing an arm, I'm rendering an arm, but you'll be able to work with the shape at the same time, and you'll be able to make a clear distinction between them. It just happens. That's one of the cool things. The light will go off in your mind, and you'll suddenly realize, I'm an artist. And that's a wonderful thought. Okay, so this core shadow is now going to become much more definite. Okay, now I'm going to lay a significantly darker pass up on this forehead area because it needs to be about as dark as this. I know the temptation is there. Like this, what I've just laid down is a little too flat. I want more in there. And my immediate gut instinct is to say, oh, I need to darken that area even more, and then put more ink on it. But because I have put so much water in there, if I were to put any more ink on this area, it would just bleed all over the place. I would have a panic attack. I would feel terrible. And so I'm just going to be patient and wait. Okay, but I'm very close now to having to blow dry this once again. And once I do, I will. Once I have blow dried this, the next time you see this, it will be very, very close to completion. So don't be surprised in the jump. Okay, since the last time you saw this, I've worked on this much more. I've brought it up to a point where if I were to use percentages, I would say this is about 97% done. I can continue to work on this, and perhaps I will, but for the purposes of our demonstration, this is a good place to stop so you can see the full range of values. You can see how building up in washes, subsequent washes and layers will give you a rich 3D effect. One of the final things that I want to show you is how to do what's called dry brushing. Now, dry brushing is a watercolor technique, and you can use it with ink, where you dip a brush, a clean brush, into the pigment, as it were, but in this case it'll be ink. And what you do, and I have to bring this tray over so you can see what I'm doing, but you dip your brush into the ink and you squeeze the excess out. It gets a little dirty, but what this does is it leaves an amount of pigment on your brush without all the extra water, and that creates a very specific effect like this. It utilizes the textures of the paper. This is something that was made very famous by the American artist Andrew Wyeth. And you can use it to great effect. It's kind of similar to glazing. You can add textures, but I use it as a glazing. That is, I will put it over an area I've already worked to add some nice textural effects. So what I'm going to do is load up my brush. I'm going to squeeze the ink out of it. And then I'm going to very carefully drag this over the areas that have translucent or lighter areas, so it will actually show up, create a nice texture. It's very forgiving. You can dab it up quickly if you need to. That's a good indication of it right there. Also going to use it a little bit in a few other places. Just to create some nice textures, to break up some of the smoothness. You don't have to do this, but I think it's important that you see how it's done. It gives a little bit of a rough feel to your ink wash, but it creates visual interest, helps lead the eye around the piece. This is also the time that in any areas that you need to add any final darks that you would use very close to full ink. You can dab that up, but areas that need the darkest darks, like at the corners of the mouth, so I can establish that mouth. Areas around the eye. And also this is the time that you would put any contour lines that are necessary. If you've got jagged lines around your piece that you want to actually have a hard line, now is the time to go back in and do that. I'm using a very thin brush to do this, but there is a very specific contour I want in this ear that I want to show up along the neckline. This is important when you've got jaggedy strokes. Right along the chin here. To give some definition along this side of the face. The actual contour of his lip. the corner of his nostril. And a little bit more in there. Soften it up. This is also the time to determine where your lights and highlights are going to be and what's going to be the brightest bright. For instance, this area up here on the statue had a lot of brights, and they just kind of follow this dot, dot, dot pattern. I really don't want that in my particular drawing. So what I'm going to do is just take a small amount of ink with a lot of water and just lightly cover those up, dab them so that they're still there, but they're a lot lighter than they were before. Okay. Any areas that I want to stay very light, I will keep the color of the paper. I'll model them a little bit. You want to make sure that your brights and your highlights have various degrees of lightness and dark. The brightest area I want is right up here where the light is hitting the top of the head directly. This area should be less light than this. This is the brightest bright. Therefore, every other light needs to be a little bit darker. And so all I got to do is wet my brush a little bit with some clean water and just gently go over the area and then lightly tap it, and it leaves a very, very small stain. Okay, so you're just gradually darkening a few of these areas. But just like that. This is still pure white. All of this now has a very light wash on it. So that is how you go about creating an ink wash. You can continue, or I could continue, as I said, to take this to its logical conclusion, but for the sake of this demonstration, I assume that you get a very good idea of just how to go about using it. If you have any questions, you can contact me, email me, and I will do my best to answer. But I hope this demonstration has given you enough information that you can get started working on your own ink wash.